I see maybe the sport and bodybuilding as well to a degree, maybe kind of going is towards that kind of like um, public health initiatives where we can kind of signpost people into sports that aid in health-based behaviours. Because I suppose when we think about powerlifting, it is or it should be very much made up of health-based behaviours where we have like exercise. Hopefully, then that brings eating well with it. Maybe a bit of weight management. Any of these kind of uh, better or more optimal kind of behaviors. But I suppose selling, like I said, selling powerlifting as the vehicle to get there is kind of the hard sell.
For sure. I think like when you think about bodybuilding, besides the competition aspect, it should be almost the best option as a vehicle because you're
Mm.
talking about like getting hypertrophy, which then helps with sarcopenia. You're talking about lower injury rates compared to strength sports. You're talking about something a lot more flexible and like, you don't need to be ultra specific. But equally, I think for a lot of people, if you tell them bodybuilding, that has a connotation of, okay, so now I need to get very lean and worry about how I look a lot. When in reality, off-season bodybuilders might be amongst the healthiest strength sport athletes, probably. So it's interesting how, depending on the population you're talking about, bodybuilding and powerlifting can definitely be a nice intervention. I agree.
Yeah, I think I like you said though, like I suppose we it's the marriage of the should be the healthiest populations. I think I like obviously like the idea of the sport having some negative connotations, I suppose, does kind of come from drug use mainly. And maybe within bodybuilding, I suppose a lot of the neuroticism, the inward neuroticism that might come with the later stages of prep, as both of you can definitely attest to.
Indeed, no, I agree 100%. And I think when you say powerlifting, the general population might not have too many preconceptions besides, like, certainly not as steroid focused as if you say bodybuilding. I think if you say bodybuilding, a lot of gym pop people think about Ronnie Coleman or Jay Cutler or just some random jack dude they once saw in a magazine.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I think powerlifting can be good in that regard.
Yeah, I think from like as you're saying there, like if you look at like the middle portion of like bodybuilding, powerlifting, like outside of competition prep, a lot of the things you're doing are pretty much health oriented behaviors. Outside of the neurotic tendencies, absolutely. Like, there is subsectors of bodybuilding which they will only have, the same four meals, meal after meal, every single day. And that's like the only way that they really know how to get progress. And when that's what the public perception of what bodybuilding is, that does not seem very sexy. But then also powerlifting has like the benefit of you shift away the focus from like people's body image or how their body looks, because again, that's something that other people in general population would be like, I don't want to become obsessed with like having a six pack or having huge muscles. And even just having that focus solely as the driver of exercise is not necessarily going to be the best for like long term gains. Like, even as a bodybuilder season to season, like I'm trying to focus on growing my delts, right? If I was to just be looking at my delts after every session, assessing my progress there, like that is going to be like woefully depressing, and
Sad.
that's even with what I know about like that's even what I know about like
Yeah.
weight.
Especially looking at Shane's delts anyway, it'd be depressive.
No, Shane is jacked. Like, I'm not sure people
He is
realize.
jacked.
I
Yeah,
actually
yeah.
met him in Pure Muscle in Canada, and like, dude's got a physique.
Dense.
But especially with,
Density
like
for
what
sure.
but especially with, like, as you get towards a level of advancement, you do get towards a realistic expectation of what you can get from like a period of training. But the general population don't have that. Like as we were talking
Mm.
with Dan Van Hook in our podcast with him in regards to like the increase of strength that you'll get in like your first year, and it's similar enough with the likes of the amount of muscle mass that you're going to gain in your first year too, and that starts to level off. And then after that, it's like, if your sole focus is that physical change, how does that promote your kind of longevity? But then it comes back to the become more process oriented over time. So, but those processes are the health oriented, more kind of process related factors of bodybuilding, of powerlifting, that will promote longevity. So it can be a tough sell, and I completely understand why maybe the public's perception of it being this extremely boring, monotonous thing is maybe not
I think,
necessarily a selling point.
Yeah, a couple things come to mind. With bodybuilding, I think one thing that separates it from a lot of strength sports is that there is an emphasis on staying satiated via, for example, fiber and getting micronutrient-dense foods in and that sort of stuff. So that's one positive. By the way, did you just mention Daniel van den Hoek? I think that's
Yes.
how you pronounce it.
Yeah.
That's surreal because for a second my brain was like, you know this name. Where do you know this name from? And then I realized we've collaborated on papers looking at obviously what you've spoken about, like the progression of strength over the years, looking at analyses of databases. So yeah, very cool papers. Also very depressing if you look at them the wrong way, I think.
Yeah. I think when you look at the strength gains after maybe the 50 year, yeah, you're kind of sitting there going, oh, Jesus Christ.
Yeah. And then you always hope you're the one outlier, like, I don't know,
And,
Jesse
yeah.
Morris, Larry Wheels or something, who keep progressing relatively speaking, but then, it's sad looking at the averages.
Yeah, the curve flattens, unfortunately.
It does.
I suppose what would be a nice little segue then into what you've kind of done then with your own research there when you brought that up. So, you kind of like you were obviously in Solent. So you have a cool research group there, obviously with James and Pack and yourself and a few others. So do you want to talk a little bit? Like, some people will know you, other people won't. So just like
100%. So as of about a week ago, actually, I finished my PhD. As Lawrence mentioned, I did my PhD at Solent University in the UK. The other researchers at my university were generally resistance training interested. Like, there's been some research going on for a while looking at mostly, not necessarily competitive bodybuilding or competitive powerlifting, but sort of general lifting weights, right? Pack, for example, Dr. Pack has done some research in powerlifting specifically, looking at what the minimum doses for making any gains in the powerlifts. So that was an interesting PhD. My PhD was on the effects of range of motion during resistance training on hypertrophy and strength. So essentially, when you lift, you have a variety of choices to make. How many sets do you do? How many reps do you do? What exercises do you pick? One of those choices is range of motion. You can either go through a full range of motion, getting a full stretch and a full squeeze on every rep, going through the whole motion of the movement, or you can use a partial range of motion. Just a range of motion that's in some capacity smaller than the full range of motion, right? Could be a very small rep, could be a larger rep, but it's simply not the full rep. And so the topic of my PhD was simply to look at the literature, conduct some studies on that topic, and to determine, okay, what is the best range of motion for hypertrophy? What is the best range of motion for strength? How do we view range of motion within training? Like, are there certain things that impact our behaviors, like, I don't know, pain, preference, that sort of stuff? So that was, broadly speaking, the topic of my PhD. And that comes from me having competed in both bodybuilding and powerlifting. Not super well in either, but I have competed. So that's something, I suppose, at least gives me some grounding to interpret the research.
So that's kind of, I suppose, when we think about the maybe back to maybe during my undergrad, when you were watching Renaissance periodization videos, and we're all like looking at Mike here, and Mike's sitting at the table, and he's saying you need to go through full range of motion. So did your research corroborate this, or are you kind of saying, well, Mike, you can shit in your hands and clap here?
So it's funny because that is part of the reason I went to study range of motion in the first place. It's because I was working for Renaissance periodization at the time. It was a topic of interest. There had been a recent systematic review on the topic. So it was kind of the topic du jour, right? And so I went to study range of motion. And if anything, it's amusing because I've been recently, I guess, accused of being biased about range of motion by one Jared Feather. But anyways, I've been accused of being biased, but it's interesting because when you really consider the situation, look, I was working for Renaissance periodization. Renaissance periodization funded my PhD. Going into the PhD, I had just read the systematic review on range of motion where it was like, yep, full range of motion is best for growth. So if anything, like, besides Renaissance periodization advocating for full range of motion, besides being funded by Renaissance periodization, besides my educational background being pro full range of motion, in my own training I was doing exclusively full range of motion, right? I was finding ways to do more range of motion. If anything, you'd expect my bias to be pro full range of motion. And when I finally got the results from a meta-analysis and I looked at it, I was like, first of all, the effects we think are like, using a full range of motion doesn't lead to much better results than not using a full range of motion. in the literature across all the studies we have. It's a trivial effect size. So even if you were to interpret it by percentages or what have you, it just doesn't make a huge difference, right? And then the second thing is, depending on how you analyze the data, it turns out full range of motion wasn't best for hypertrophy. And when I looked at that, I was like, but wait a minute. Previous review papers had found full range of motion was best for hypertrophy, and that's what I've been taught. And like it actually like took me a few days. I remember sending some messages to friends and like, I got these results. Like I think I might have like messed up the data extraction or the coding. Like something might have gone wrong because like the results just don't really seem right to me, you know.
You were
but then I looked at them
scrolling through SPSS. Looking,
exactly, and I was like, this doesn't make sense. And then I thought about it, and then very gradually, you can see it in my training, maybe on YouTube, I guess. I shifted from doing full range of motion to gradually incorporating more lengthened partials, and my train of thought very gradually said, okay, well, the results from that analysis suggest lengthened partials, so partial repetitions in that stretch position, are better for hypertrophy than full range of motion. There wasn't a huge amount of studies, so I was like, okay, it might be, but let's see. Since then, there have been more studies kind of corroborating the idea, so I'm a little bit more confident now than I was a few years ago. But even then, I was like, okay, let's start experimenting a little bit. So I started by doing some partials at the end of my sets, for example. When I couldn't get another full range of motion rep, I would just do some partials in that lengthened or stretch position. And then eventually I did some more thinking, some more studies came out, and it just didn't seem reasonable to me to take all these roundabout approaches. And I was like, you know what, like if these studies really do show better growth by doing just lengthened partials versus just doing full range of motion, maybe I should just do lengthened partials instead of trying to find like, you know, maybe isometric holds in a stretch position or doing partials at the end of the set. Why not try the actual thing, right? Why water it down with something potentially inferior? And so I did that, and I haven't shrunk, I don't think. So at least that's one anecdote in favor of it. Yeah, that's kind of the background there as to how Renaissance periodization informed the whole thing. And to their huge credit, by the way, they go out of their way to fund science. They're generally, I would say, open to changing their stances. Like nowadays, I think, for example, they're a bit more open to lengthened partials or the stretch position, etc. So yeah, but the thing I was going to say in closing is, going into it, I was hoping for range of motion was best, kind of, and it wasn't, so I had to change my stance. That's it.
Change your mind. And for you, I suppose, kind of with your own training, I suppose it's interesting that like you'll openly admit that your positionality approaching the research was full on, obviously. And I think that's kind of the beauty of research is kind of, and I suppose that is the definition of being evidence-based. And I think it's kind of a meme almost within our area that always evidence-based. But I think to be truly able to say that you're evidence-based as being despite the weight of the argument and maybe the consensus that you actually can change your approach to things, that you can change your mind to things. So I think even for you to be able to say that is a testament to yourself, like, because it's hard, like when a dogma exists, especially within bodybuilding, I suppose, because me and Shane say this all the time, we do kind of look back and laugh at the intuition of bodybuilders from long ago in the 60s and 70s, where they would do, like you said, like they would go to failure through full ROM and extend the set to failure again through that lengthened partials. And I suppose within that's it's a different kind of stimulus, and I suppose as a stimulus and overall volume, it can be hard to track, or I would interpret it as being hard to track. So maybe you can tune in on that, maybe about your own approach to it. But yeah,
for sure. I think whenever you talk about these old school bodybuilders did this, and now science has shown it might be the right way to do things, it's interesting because bodybuilders, I think, and maybe it's just because I'm more in tune with what bodybuilders have done overall, because that's my preferred way of training and sort of interest. But I think they're not a very homogenous population. I think as far as their practices go, if you look back, you had Mike Menzer doing just minimal sets like once every 10 days sometimes. But then you had the opposite, where it was like Ronnie Coleman doing 40 sets for back twice a week. So like you clearly had a spectrum of approaches. So if you wanted to post hoc analyze, okay, well, we found this, and this makes a lot of sense because Ronnie trained this way, like you can literally make that up about anything. So I'm always like, when Mike Menzer fanboys, for example, come up and like, Mike Menzer knew this 40 years ago. Why are we talking about this now? It's always very funny. But regarding tracking length and partials or any partial range of motion, I think the same general principles apply. Just like with full range of motion, with full range of motion, there has always been a point made about trying to standardize the range of motion as best you can. It's a bit easier with full range of motion because you can typically just go as deep as you can and get as much of a peak squeeze as you can, and that will mostly take care of range of motion standardization, right? Because assuming your range of motion and mobility stay the same session to session, it's mostly taken care of. With length and partials, you essentially have to find one end point through the rep, right? Because ultimately you're still talking about getting as deep of a stretch as you can, but then you're ending the rep kind of halfway up typically. Half reps are usually what I recommend. The reason for that is, out of now 5 studies, one is unpublished, but let's count it in anyways. 5 studies that look at length and partials, 4 have used half reps versus full reps. So when we're trying to draw inferences from the data, it's worth using the same sort of protocol they're using. Half reps seem to be a good starting point, roughly. The good thing is, it probably doesn't matter a huge amount whether you're doing like 2/3 reps or 1/3 reps, as long as it's somewhere in the half ballpark. And that opens up some leeway to find a way to standardize the range of motion. For example, on a machine row, oftentimes there'll be like some sort of knob you can use to set the chest pad with, right? And that's typically about halfway in the repetition. So if you just pull the machine to that point, congratulations, you've just standardized the range of motion about as well as you could with full range of motion. For most exercises, machine-based and cable-based especially, there's some sort of feature of the machine you can use as a landmark to end the rep at, right? For other exercises, like especially compound lower body or compound upper body exercises, for pressing and squatting, typically I just kind of aim for a 90-degree angle. Shout out Joel Seedman, that's exactly where I took it from. No, it's actually just because I think 90 degrees is like the most intuitive for most people, and it's about a half rep. But that's for squatting and pressing movements. For bent over rows and RDLs, for example, or rows in general, really, you can just pull to just past your knee, I would say. And like your knees, unless you have strange technique or very sort of body English involving technique, your positioning will be pretty consistent. So if you just pull to past your knee, right, as soon as the barbell clears your knees, you start the descent again. That will standardize the range of motion very well as well. What I'm saying is, for most movements, there's some sort of feature or landmark you can use to pretty consistently standardize it. At least in my experience and my clients' experiences, we haven't had any issues. And we are running a study on length and partials at the moment, where people do strength testing and with length and partials. And so one thing we did in the run-up to that study was just conduct some very basic small sample size reliability testing to see whether people get the same numbers when doing length and partials in 2 sessions. They come into the gym, do some testing, 6-rep max testing, they do some length and partials, and then a few days later, in the same conditions, they repeat it, and we just see whether or not they get the same numbers. If they get the same numbers, and they're actually trying hard in both sessions, in all likelihood, their range of motion was pretty similar. Otherwise, they would get different numbers, right?
That's where, yeah.
Their range of motion was pretty consistent. So, and their numbers were very consistent. So, I think it's more of a theoretical concern. And strictly speaking, like depending on the study you're looking at, in some of these studies, they didn't have super sophisticated means of controlling for range of motion in the first place. So in all likelihood, they probably did exactly the same thing that you do, which is look at your own range of motion and decide, okay, the rep is over here, right? And that's how they standardize range of motion in some of these studies. And so if in these studies, doing it that way didn't negate the benefit of length and partials for hypertrophy, then there's a good chance that you shouldn't even worry about it in practice. So altogether, I think it's more of a concern theoretically than it is practically.
I think that was one thing that came to mind for me, was when you would ask people, gauging proximity to failure, gauging, like we know that there's a high degree of reliability within someone's ability, well, relatively depending on the people and their training experience of their gauging their proximity to failure. I suppose now that you're in the process of that and you are looking at the inter-participant reliability across both days, I think that will be interesting to see.
For sure. And so far it's seemed pretty reliable. Again, it's the sort of, I don't know if you've ever experienced this, but there's certain, when it comes to a study, like any study, or when it comes to a certain training approach, people will often use these thought experiments to stretch something to its extreme to see, okay, well, what theoretical issues could there be here? For studies, if they don't like a study especially, there'll be a few blanket critiques they throw out, like, small sample size. Or, I mean, they were untrained, so how's that generalized to me? I've been training for 2 years. I'm totally different from these people, right? I think there's a few common critiques people throw at studies individually when they don't like the results or whatever. And I think there's a few things that people throw at training techniques as more like theoretical concerns than anything actually empirically based, right? Because if you look at these studies and let's say, for example, I don't know, let's say drop sets caused more muscle growth than traditional sets. People could say, well, with drop sets, maybe like you're more sweaty and so the set gets worse. And it's like, yeah, but ultimately that's not empirical. Empirically, we see that there's more muscle growth. And so I think people often take these things and think them through, and that's helpful in the absence of evidence. But I think when you have evidence, and obviously there's a disconnect between what you do in a lab and what you do in practice, where, for example, just because you find something in a lab doesn't mean it's going to translate to real world, right? But I think people often will just try and find something wrong with the technique for the sake of it almost.
Yeah, no, I think even when you with that reliability study, we'll answer a lot of those questions. I think because it's even interesting that you said they weren't strict in defining range of motion, that they were just like half a rep, and like I suppose in even within that, where a lot of people might make the complaint that these lab studies they're not real life, they're not real world. If the researchers are saying just to participants just do half of what you normally do, I think that's as clear a directive as any PT or coach will give anyone out in the real world.
For sure. And it's crazy because this one study, and in general, by the way, I think there is some validity to the argument, but I think people often overuse it, just dismiss studies out of hand when they have a certain epistemic perspective where they say, actually, I'm not going to let science inform my training, which there might be some truth to, but for the most part, it's also just a way to make your training a little bit worse for no reason. But when it comes to this study specifically, we have literally made a point to make it as ecologically valid as possible. So we're comparing lengthened partials to full range of motion in trained lifters who've been training for at least 3 years, and their training is being performed unsupervised, but as their sort of guidelines, they receive videos telling them this is what the range of motion should look like. If you're doing a full range of motion, if you're doing lengthened partials. That's pretty much exactly how you would train in practice, where you would look at a video online and be like, oh, this is how you perform this exercise, and you'd go away and do it. Would you do it perfectly? Probably not. So that's kind of a disconnect between how you do in practice and how it happened in the lab. In the lab, they might be able to actually control the range of motion to the degree, right, with certain equipment that we use. But in this study, it's literally in trained lifters who've been training for at least 3 years. It's done on your own. It's using reference videos, so not super controlled or anything. You know, like if that study does find a benefit of lengthened partials or doesn't, that will be the most ecologically valid way of looking at lengthened partials.
I think that's a cool way of going about answering that research question as well, that it is bridging that gap. What I suppose for you, when you were kind of implementing it into your own training, and I suppose people are going to be listening to this now and they're going to start doing half reps left, right and centre, how did you incorporate that, or what exercises would you kind of intuitively say this is going to work well here?
Sure. So at this stage, I think this is going to be rife with speculation, but I think we can make some educated guesses. It's all good. It's all good.
That's all good.
So I think, like, honestly, back training, shoulder training, bicep training are probably the main ones. In the exercises, and it's not anything to do with the muscles, by the way. Like, the muscles themselves probably aren't that magical. There's probably nothing that unique about them that predisposes them towards responding more favorably. Back musculature, the biceps, the shoulders. Those exercises very rarely involve much tension or force production requirements in that stress position, right? Let's talk about the side delts. Almost everyone trains their side delts with a dumbbell lat raise. Now, in the double lat raise, first of all, you're not getting really a stretch in your side delts, right? Like, you're just sort of stopping when your arm gets relaxed, just like when you're standing almost, which isn't really a stretch for the side delts. And additionally, at the bottom of a dumbbell ladder raise, you do not need to produce much force to get the weight moving. The force production requirements are very, very low. So as far as actually stimulating the side delts in that stretch position, it just doesn't do a great job. And it turns out for the back, the biceps, and the side delts, that is typically the case for most exercises. The back is the main culprit, where pretty much any back exercise you can think of, with a few exceptions, like a cable row, like a pull down, like a pull-up, all of those exercises will be most challenging in that shortened position, right? At the stretch, you could do a lot more weight. you could be producing a lot more force than you need to in order to complete a full range of motion repetition. And so for these body parts and these exercises is where lengthened partials might come in the most handy, as opposed to, let's say, for example, a bench press or a squat, right? In these exercises, even when you're at the most lengthened position, at the very bottom of the squat, when the bar is sort of on your chest with the bench, in those positions, there is plenty of need for force production, right? You can't get away with slacking off there because it's actually quite a hard lift in those positions. And so even if you were to switch to lengthened partials on the squat and the bench, for example, it wouldn't change the lift all that much. These lifts are still relatively easier at the very top versus the very bottom, right? So it's more useful and likely more applicable on certain movements, whereas for certain movements like the squat, the bench, etc., it might be a little bit more down to personal preference than anything really about muscle growth. You might get the same muscle growth doing full range of motion or lengthened partials on the squat and bench, for example, or most chest walk. That being said, because most muscle groups do seem to respond favorably to lengthened partials, or lengthened training in general, there's about 25 studies overall comparing more lengthened training to more shortened training. And the general principle of lengthened training leads to more growth appears to generalize across a pretty wide variety of muscle groups that we've measured. And so, if you asked me, okay, I'm going to pay you $1 billion if you get this person their maximum growth, do you make them do lengthened partials on, for example, the bench or the squat? I would say probably yes, right? But I think it's going to be a much smaller difference than with the back or the biceps or the side delts. Yeah. So that's my general approach. I think there are certain movements you can pick as well. So it's not as though you only have to do lengthened partials. There's other approaches you can use to still bias that lengthened position in some sense without necessarily doing partials. For example, for the chest and for the back, two great exercises are likely to be the dumbbell fly, where you get a deep stretch on every rep and it's essentially already a lengthened partial. Plus, the hardest part of the movement is at the very bottom, when your chest is fully stretched out. And for the back, that's the dumbbell pullover. The dumbbell pullover is probably a better option than, say, cable pullover or machine pullover for the most part, unless those machines or cables are sort of modified to bias that lengthened position. Because with a dumbbell or a barbell pullover, that stretch position is the hardest. And when you finish a rep, your back isn't actually shortened. So again, by definition, it's a lengthened partial. So I think there are certain movements you can pick for most muscle groups that will be straight up better, even with a full range of motion than others, on account of this sort of phenomenon of lengthened training being better for hypertrophy. But I think a lengthened partial can be a great equalizer, in that even movements that don't have the best resistance curve, right, that are still pretty hard in a shortened position. If now, for example, you were to start doing lengthened partials on the barbell row, even though the barbell row isn't ideal for hypertrophy because it's still hardest in the shortened position, if you just switch to lengthened partial, you would instantly be able to use 20% more load. Would it be ideal? No, you probably still fail in that shortened position. But it'd be a lot better than if you did full range of motion. So lengthened partials can be a very sort of simple, straightforward, caveman tool to make an exercise better for hypertrophy, in all likelihood.
No, I think that was brilliant. I think anyone listening to that now kind of will have a good understanding, at least even for the basis of your research. I think it's kind of lost on a lot of people, and I think when you're obviously, yourself, myself and Shane are obviously all of the same generation, that we saw people reverse banding stuff on Smith machines, and we saw, and you're laughing as well, but we saw people a huge emphasis on training the strength curve, that okay, this muscle group is strongest in its lengthened range, this muscle group is weakest in the shortened range, so we're going to really, really, really hammer that home. And I think a lot of people kind of scoffed at that originally, and that's only in the last maybe 5 or 6 years that kind of style of training has come to fruition. We've seen it a lot in powerlifting, where I suppose we would look intuitively at a lift and say, this lift, you're very strong off the floor. Whereas here, you're quite weak at lockout. So we're going to train that portion of the lift. And that's been around in weightlifting, in powerlifting for forever. I mean, if we go back to old Russian models of periodization, the variations or the competition specific exercises would get lower in off season, and we'd train those ranges of motion. So it's not remotely a new concept, but I suppose when we do think about training something in the average gym goer, training something in the lengthened or the shortened range just goes over their head, but they might be doing it anyway.
100%. I think with strength specifically, there's a whole other can of worms Let me touch on the sort of broad strength findings first. First, it seems like adaptations are absolutely range of motion specific. So if you're a powerlifter, most of your training should take place just to powerlifting depth in the squat, just to your usual bench depth in the bench, right? Like if you use an arch, etc. Mostly, same with the deadlift, right? You should mostly do actual deadlifts versus deficit or block deadlifts. That's generally the case. And specificity absolutely applies to range of motion, it seems, as it does for loading range, right? Like the heavier you lift for powerlifting on a set per set basis, the more strength gains you'll see in a 1 rep max. Likewise, machines, like training with machines improves your machine strength more than training with free weights, and training with free weights improves your free weight strength more than training with machines. So generally specificity applies, and it also applies to range of motion. Now, there have been about 4 studies, to my knowledge, combining a full range of motion, quote unquote, or essentially the range of motion of the outcome, right? Because oftentimes they test for range of motion strength with a partial range of motion, right? So like, for example, half their training could be full range of motion squats and half their training could be half squats versus a group doing only full range of motion squats and then measuring full range of motion squat strength at the end. Now, based on those 4 studies, having some partial range of motion training in your routine as a powerlifter is probably going to have a neutral to slightly positive effect on your strength. So even if you want to be perfectly specific, and you're like, oh, specificity is all that matters, there is some limited evidence that having some partial range of motion training in your routine could be helpful. And in fact, if you look at the survey data we got from people training for strength and for hypertrophy and how their range of motion practices were, a lot of people, as you mentioned, use partial ranges of motion to target weak points in their lift. Now, I think that's a huge can of worms. And I think this is something that, for example, Greg Nuckols from Storey Science has written about, where identifying weak points to begin with in the squat, bench, and deadlift is probably a lot more challenging and is fraught with many more assumptions than we think. For example, what do you consider the weak point? Do you consider the weak point the point of the lift where you're slowest, or the point of the lift where bar speed is slowing down the most, right? Like, is it where bar speed stops, the bar just stops for a moment, or is it the part where it actually slows down? That's one part. Then the second layer of assumptions is, okay, let's assume that's the case. Do we know what muscle groups are actually responsible the most in that specific range of motion? And do we have a good reason, a good rationale for isolating them, for example, via hypertrophy work, or via specifically training that range of motion? Do we have evidence for that actually working? No. Okay. So there's just a lot of assumptions that go into like weak point identification and then weak point targeting from a programming perspective, which is, frustrating because you wish powerlifting programming could be this super like data-driven thing where it's like, oh, okay, and I'm going to program this in, it's going to fix their weak point, they're going to add 80 pounds to their squat, it's going to be awesome. But in reality, a lot of the time, it might just be, okay, let's make them practice the main lifts, mostly in the range of motion that we're targeting, get them a little bit bigger over time, and, inshallah, they'll get stronger. That's about it.
Yeah, we were talking recently to Charlotte Perrault. She's done her PhD in kind of heavily around the biomechanics of the squat. And I'm going to absolutely butcher that entire podcast here, but she was essentially saying, similarly to what you said, that it's quite difficult to ascertain what contributes to the sticking point. She said she was kind of talking about how she went in expecting to be able to create a lovely biomechanical model of the squat and what contributes to each at each point of the squat, and when the knee is this angle and the hip is this angle, but she said it was just impossible. She spoke a lot about kind of the position of center of gravity, and maybe that contributing to the changes in center of gravity throughout the squat can shift load more or less onto certain joints, and she said that's so individualized that she couldn't create much of a consensus on what that was. Shane, am I making an alright job of that, or am I fucking the whole thing up?
No, you are, and I think even with that, it's like with the partial range of motion training or kind of utilizing some of those variations as a means to increase either your strength at that second point or increase the speed at that second point. Like sometimes those variations can almost be just be thrown into a program as a means to like accommodate load or just even add some actual variety into a training program, right? Because like as you get more advanced and you get stronger, if you're doing 3 or 4 days of your competition bench, if you're already a very strong bencher, even if you are doing a set of 7, it probably is going to still be relatively high mental load. Whereas like if you are accommodating some of your load through having like a short range of motion, for example, like that could in turn reduce overall fatigue, but there may be the added benefit of it could potentially increase your strength or decrease the slowness of that portion of the lift. And I suppose the way you kind of look at that is your competition bench increasing over time? Is the E1RM moving up over time? And like that's as probably technical as you can really get with it. Because at the end of the day, look, I think if you're training for a long period of time, you probably don't want to be doing your competition lifts only forever. Like even as the most like hardcore bodybuilder or powerlifter, having a little bit of variety in there is kind of nice.
Just for the fucking elbows and bicep tendons, so they're not collapsing off you like me at the age of fucking 27. But where I suppose the key, not the key, oh Jesus, me the fucking key, but where I see real utility in kind of changing around the range of motion within certain lifts is obviously, like Shane said, where you might have a staleness element. Someone's off the back of an 8-week peak where they're probably only doing competition lifts, and I suppose like anything, if someone gets stronger in a variation in a competition lift, the caveat to all of this is, even with a lessened range of motion, even if they're getting stronger in a lessened range of motion, as long as we're increasing absolute force producing capabilities, they've gotten stronger. Is it to say that the variation itself was contributing? Potentially not. It's probably more so that they were adherent and they trained very, very hard.
Exactly, literally. I think nowadays, like, variations in range of motion and many things in powerlifting and bodybuilding are similar in some regard, but also dissimilar. I think a lot of powerlifters are relatively newer generation nowadays, where they want every training decision they make to be evidence-based or data-driven, right? And so they think there is more data and more evidence than really is for a lot of decisions. For example, like, oh, I'm going to incorporate pin presses, it's going to blow up my lockout, and all of a sudden I'm going to have this huge bench. It's going to work exactly like I predicted. And they really want to make these changes and think there's a lot of evidence behind them. Bodybuilders are the same in the sense that they'll try a lot of stuff, but usually they don't care about the evidence. It's just because someone said so, like 20 years ago, and they were jacked. So it's different reasons for trying out different stuff and thinking it's going to work. With partials for powerlifting, honestly, I think most of it is, as you mentioned, staleness, or if someone feels like, man, I'm low bar squatting 3 times a week to full depth and then my elbows don't really like it anymore, could I do something else? And you're like, yeah, sure, let's do some partials or whatever, right? And equally, I think the other reason is simply preference overall. Like, if you ask them, oh, would you rather do pin presses or like a spoto press? And they say spoto presses. At this stage, I couldn't tell you that one of them would work better on principle, besides the one that they probably prefer doing and put more effort into. So,
yeah, no, definitely. I suppose I'm kind of interested as well in, and I don't know if people will be screaming at me to say shut up, but obviously we know that within the length and range there's certain adaptations that will come from that, because we're saying, okay, if within the length and range we're getting a certain adaptation that we may not get from a full range. So the partial in the lengthened range, we're getting a slightly better adaptation than a partial in the shortened range. So could you maybe go through a little bit on, like, you don't need to go too heavy into this, but a little bit on what adaptation maybe we're seeing at a fiber level?
Sure. So basically, if I get your question correctly, it's basically what's the difference between partials at longer muscle lengths versus shorter muscle lengths from an adaptation standpoint?
Yeah,
sure.
Yeah.
So by and large, partials at short muscle lengths are the worst of the approaches you could take for hypertrophy. Like between full range of motion, partials at longer muscle lengths, maybe like mid-range partials where you're keeping constant tension on the muscle, if that's something you've heard about, or short muscle length partials. Short muscle length partials seem to be the worst approach. It seems as though the average muscle length at which you train does determine how much hypertrophy you get. And so lengthened partials is simply a vehicle for that, right? Where because you're spending the whole set in that lengthened position and there is relatively high force production requirements, you're getting a solid stimulus. A full range of motion delivers most of that as well, but you are spending, let's say, for argument's sake, keeping it simple, half the set at shorter muscle lengths. Short muscle length partials take that from half the set to 100% of the set. And so if you acknowledge that lengthened training is better for hypertrophy than shortened training, which seems to be the case across about 25 studies, then shortened partials are kind of the best you can do. And in fact, we have 8 studies comparing lengthened partials to shortened partials directly. So doing either partial reps in the stretch position, like the bottom of a bicep curl, or in the shortened position, like the top of a bicep curl, right? And across these 8 studies, 7 found better hypertrophy with lengthened partials over shortened partials, and 1 found no difference. So just like when you compare lengthened partials to full range of motion, there has never been a case where the shorter muscle length group grew more than the longer muscle length group. There's just never been such a study, to my knowledge. So shortened partials are definitely not what you should be doing, and you should pay attention to what muscle length you're doing these partials at. You shouldn't just be like, okay, Milo said partials, we're doing partials, and just randomly do reps completely at random, essentially. I would say as far as the adaptations are concerned, hypertrophy-wise or on the fiber level, I can't tell you much more than this. Generally, lengthened training seems to be better at growing distal areas of a muscle. If you look at the regional hypertrophy data we have, so essentially how do different areas of a muscle grow after training, it seems like lengthened training hypertrophies predominantly, or a bit more, those distal areas. Distal simply refers to being further away from the origin site or being closer to the insertion site of a muscle. Insertion site is basically just, you have the midpoint of your body, right? The insertion site of a muscle is the point at which a muscle attaches that's further away from the midpoint of your body, so from the navel, essentially. And basically, lengthened training just grows distal areas a little bit better. As far as proximal areas, or closer to the origin point, so the opposite, it seems like lengthened training and shortened training are about the same. But it's really at distal sites that lengthened training produces more hypertrophy.
That's an interesting one. I suppose it does it does make sense why that could occur. So that being in that kind of,
it makes sense, right? In like a very caveman way. Where it's like, lengthened training, it makes it grow more at length, like far away.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I suppose, does that maybe bring in the case then for maybe some of the discussion around stretch mediated hypertrophy? And is that kind of maybe an area that you could see? Because I suppose where my area is older adults, there is a fair bit of research on older adults just doing stretch, creating some degree of adaptation when it comes to hypertrophy. So I suppose within highly trained individuals, we could maybe make an assumption that the stretch would need to be more extreme. But again, that's intuition. But could you maybe talk a little bit about that? Or
for sure.
Maybe
sure.
Tell me if I'm talking shite.
No, you're not talking shite. I think it's interesting because in relatively untrained populations, you can see muscle hypertrophy from anything from stretching to cardio to lifting weights. Now, longer term, what is going to produce the most robust hypertrophy is going to be resistance training, but that's not to say that stretching is completely useless, right? If you can't lift, for example, you don't have equipment or anything, stretching might still be able to provide some stimulus for hypertrophy. And in fact, there might be some overlap in the mechanisms for hypertrophy when you're talking about stretching for like half an hour to an hour a day versus doing lengthened partials. My hunch is that they're not the same mechanisms because we're talking about very different durations of exposure, right? We're talking about 30 to 60 minutes per day of stretching typically versus like 10 extra seconds spent at low muscle lengths, right? While lifting weights with pretty high intensities. So I don't think the mechanisms are exactly the same, but there might be some overlap there. The other thing is most of the studies we have on static stretching producing a lot of hypertrophy, again, long duration, but also in animals. So there's some caveats there. But there is some data, specifically in the calves and in the quadriceps, to my knowledge, that stretching for 10 to 60 minutes a day typically will produce some robust hypertrophy. This is mostly in untrained people, so don't take it with, don't go and stop lifting weights and just stretch all day, because it's probably not going to make you Ronnie Coleman. But if you can't lift, or if you're new to lifting and someone doesn't want to lift, for example, and you still want them to get some activity in and maybe avoid sarcopenia or just grow a bit of muscle, stretching can be a way to do it. That being said, one word of caution. One of the studies that's been paraded around as an example of substantial hypertrophy occurring after stretching was a recent study by Warnicki and colleagues, where they stretched their calves for 60 minutes a day for 7 weeks in a row, I believe, every day with pretty high intensity, so like relatively painful stretching. And they saw some pretty meaningful calf hypertrophy. Now, the good Dr. Eric Helms tried to do this at home, so he bought the same device they used to stretch out the calves for 60 minutes a day and tried this, and basically gave up at some point throughout the 6 or 7 weeks it was, I think, because it was just too painful. So potentially, in order for you to get meaningful hypertrophy from it, especially if you're somewhat more trained, it may be more hassle than it's worth. Maybe just go to the gym and do a few sets of calf raises instead and call it a day, instead of stretching for 60 minutes a day. So I think stretching is an interesting modality for inducing hypertrophy, but resistance training remains by far and away the most potent stimulator.
Yeah, I think even again, I suppose I keep harping on about intuition here, but when we might think about even like an exercise like a calf raise, like if you're in the gym and you walk in, you're like gonna start training calves here. Getting into that really lengthened position, that stretch position, I think where there are certain muscle groups to maybe introduce people to resistance training that do lend themselves, like you said earlier, maybe like there are certain exercises that lend themselves to the leg, like it was the calves that came into my head there, where you can nearly have a equivalency for the feeling of the stretch, that on almost, if you get someone to stretch out their calves without any resistance training, or you get someone to do a standing calf raise, that you can, the subjective feeling of stretching versus the subjective feeling of being under load
Sure.
is almost comparable. And it's probably, just from talking to you, it's probably one of the ones I'm going to be spending a little bit more time in the length and range in.
Hey man, hopefully you see more growth. Let me know how it goes.
Yeah.
So I suppose to give some practical recommendations to people at home in regards to like how they could first go about implementing some part range of motion training for either strength, if that is something that you would recommend. If there's any general recommendations you go about maybe starting off with doing it with regards to hypertrophy, like where should one start with that?
100%. So for strength, I think you can get away with transitioning, first of all. I think for both strength and hypertrophy, the key word here is transitioning. You probably don't want to go from doing all full range of motion to doing all partials right away, for example. But let's say, for example, you're currently doing only full range of motion training for powerlifting or for strength in general. I think slowly adding in over the course of maybe a month or two some partials, maybe up to 25% or maybe a third of your training as partials for the main lifts is probably going to be a pretty good starting point. In these studies, they typically use about 25 to 50%. So they'll do 50 to 75% of their training as full range of motion, and they'll do the remainder of their training as partial range of motion, even when training for full range of motion strength. And it seems to have a neutral to positive effect on their strength. So I think that's a pretty good way to do it. So if you're doing, for example, 4 bench days across the week for powerlifting, maybe try substituting one of those days with partials, start off with a little bit less volume, and then gradually increase it as you find you're able to tolerate, right? As far as what type of partial, I think it doesn't matter hugely for powerlifting. I think the main thing is just having a partial in there. You can try to identify a weak point. You'll probably have trouble doing it accurately, but equally it probably doesn't matter. So if you think better safe than sorry in this regard, feel free to try and identify where you think you're weakest and do a partial roughly in that range, right? Equally, if you're in the off season, you might want to consider a partial or a partial exercise that's more so in the length and range. If you're someone who thinks that getting stronger or bigger in powerlifting is going to be strong in the long run, there's probably no harm in making that partial range of motion training you're doing anyways be a lengthened partial in the main lifts in some regard. So that's for strength. For hypertrophy, I think that the same applies. If you're currently doing only full range of motion, gradually transition towards more lengthened styles of training, right? I think the best way of doing it might be to take your somewhat higher rep work, where typically people don't track their performance quite as much anyways, and do length and partials on that. And specifically start with back work, with bicep work, with side delt work, where it might have the most benefit. You might find out that you hate it. Some people just don't like it. And if you don't like it, then feel free to stop doing it. It would give you a benefit in likelihood for hypertrophy, but it's not a huge benefit. It's not gonna kill your gains by any means. So give it a shot, and then I think from there, if you enjoy it and you want to take it further and you want to potentially optimize your growth, my hunch is you would do that by doing most of your training in some form of length and bias. For example, you could do some length and partials on your traditional rows, like dumbbell rows and barbell rows, to just past your knees for your back. And then you can incorporate some full range of motion in the form of, for example, a dumbbell pullover, where you don't need to worry about doing a partial because it's already length and biased. Alternatively, if you really want to push it to the extreme, and that's actually what's been studied most directly, so I say extreme in the sense that it might involve the most modification from your current training, not in the sense that it might be worse for hypertrophy, you could just do everything as length and partials. And that's what I've been doing by and large for about a year now, actually. And before that, I've been training with length and partials as well, but not fully. And at least anecdotally, I haven't shrunk, And from the studies we have, in these studies, they use exclusively length and partials. It's the most high fidelity way of applying the results from these studies to your own training. And so if you want to see the sort of results they're seeing in the studies where more hypertrophy is seen with length and partials, consider making all of your training length and partials, provided it's safe. And quick note on safety. As far as what exercises are safe to do length and partials on, you may need to change your exercise selection a little bit towards being more machine-based or dumbbell-based. Both machines, like the Smith machine for the bench press, for the squat, for the split squat, and dumbbells, are generally a lot safer to fail on while using length and partials. So that's what I typically recommend if you're like, I'm not sure this is safe, just find the alternative that's using dumbbells or a machine.
Awesome. Yeah,
That was brilliant, Milo.
I can say from my own experience, having implemented the length and partials over like the last few months, that at the start it does feel so wrong, but at the end it does feel so right at the same time. So
beautiful.
Yeah, that was deadly, Milo. Thanks so much. I'm going to do Shane's job here for a minute. I'm going to give this a go. So, Milo, if the people want to find you at home, can you tell them where they can find you and what they can find you on?
Hell yeah. You can find me on Instagram at Wolf Coach. You can also find me on YouTube at Wolf Coaching. And by the way, if anyone thinks I'm just using the word wolf because it's very cool, it's an animal, it's manly, it's actually my last name, so please don't judge me. And finally, you can find my research if you just type in Milo Wolf ResearchGate. You can find the range of motion research, some of the research on powerlifting we have, some of the research on repetitions and reserve accuracy or RP accuracy. All that stuff will be there.
Unbelievable.
That's deadly, Milo. Thanks so much.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you very much. So, Milo, thank you. I wouldn't be surprised if your middle name was Alpha, all the same. So, Alpha Wolf.
And my second last name was Destiny. Yeah.
Anyway, if you did enjoy the podcast, do make sure to hit up Milo on all his links, which I'll leave in the show notes. If you enjoyed the podcast, make sure to like it, rate it, leave a review, share it on your Instagram story. And other than that, we will catch you in the next one.